See, we're all learning. First time, second time better, third time even better, fourth time we will all win Oscar. I now have a formal complaint to file with my team. Our get-togethers are very boring. These Parsi names, they're always bouncers. Guys, are we good to go?
You're really putting the bio in biome over here.
I'm so sorry, I messed it up. See, now we can start it again. Hello and welcome to another episode of Ideas to Enterprises. I'm super excited about this one. Today's guest is Rukmini S. She's a data journalist, having been in the space for over a decade. She started off in 2010. I discovered her personally through her book Whole Numbers and Half Truths. Fantastic book that actually changed and challenged my perspectives around India, the economy, and Indian life in general. You'll hear a lot of insights and a lot of facts coming out of Rukmini from there. She's also the founder and director of Data for India, a phenomenal public platform with the mission to expand the understanding of India for everyone through data. I hope through this conversation you're able to appreciate and enjoy, as I have, how Rukmini packs every insight, more importantly every surprise about our country with the nuance and the delicate nature that it so deserves. She's definitely one of the most refreshing voices in the space, and I'm very excited for today's episode. With that, I give you Rukmini. Rukmini, hi, welcome to the podcast. We're so excited to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really look forward to this.
Rukmini, you strike me as one of the more clear thinkers in our country today, talking about information, talking about data. You lead Data for India. You've written a fantastic book. That's kind of how I came across all your work, and stunned by the amazing work Data for India is doing. What I'd like to start off with is just a question. What is one aspect about the India story that everyone believes that data has proven otherwise?
So let me start with the lighter one, and then we can get into the meatier stuff. And pun intended there. One of the things that one of the misconceptions that many people have about India, for example, is that it's a vegetarian country. And one of the things we know from data is that 8 in 10 people eat meat. And I like this, as an example because in some ways it forces us or challenges us to look at our own priors. If this is a misconception some of us might have, then it's sort of instructional to think about where it may have come from, because the data certainly not shown that for a long time. So if you feel that it's the movies you're watching or the media that you're consuming that's given you that impression, or even your own bubble that's given you that impression, then it may be a good time to consider how to get alternative sources of information that could cover some of this stuff. About the country or the India story more broadly, I think there's actually two directions that people come at the India story from. And in some ways, for me, this encapsulates so much of the conversation in India and around India that is so deeply polarized in a way that has sort of obscured the truth because of just how polarized it is. So I'd say the two directions that people usually come at the India story at are either that it's fake, that there isn't a growth story, or they come at it with that it's universal, that it's all encompassing, and it's uniform. And I think what we're seeing repeatedly, I mean, I feel like if I had to do at Data for India and the pieces we put out, we do a small sort of excerpt at the top. And I'm, always struggling to write that one well. It matters for SEO. I really need to pay attention to that. But I feel sometimes that I could write the same one for every piece, which would be that things are getting better, but not completely perfect for everyone yet. That's essentially, to me, the parts of the India story that uh, I don't like to say both sides because there aren't just two sides and there shouldn't be really. But these are the two angles at which people come at the India story, and they're both in their own ways partly wrong.
So it almost sounds like there's this K shape that we should be thinking about. On one side, it's not that things aren't getting better, they definitely are. It just might be that the nuance we have to add to this story is that it's getting a lot better for some, and for others, maybe there's a little bit of catch up that needs to take place.
Yeah, it's that too, and also aspects of what are getting better, right? Like, so it might be that the infrastructure for all of it is now largely in place, But the last mile stuff that needs to happen to make it work is not universally happening. I think this is the case for electrification. It's also the case for access to water. It's the case for access to sanitation, where what's really happened in the last 20 years is this massive increase in the ability to deliver the infrastructure. That really is happening. But infrastructure doesn't equal usage. So some of the stuff that needs to happen to make not just pipes reach the person's house, but for that water to be potable and to come through the day, those things, there's still catch up there. So it's not just that it's not for everyone yet, but it's also not uniformly usable yet.
Now, in a country where getting information like this is a bit challenging, you have started Data for India. What was the idea behind that? What is Data for India? And what compelled you to start an organization such as this?
So I come from a journalism background. This it was for sort of general interest, field reporting journalism, and then I made this pivot to data journalism some time ago. And then I wrote a book in at the end of 2021, which was sort of pulling together some of my experiences, both from what good data could tell us about how the country was changing, as well as what my experiences as a field reporter had shown me that the data sometimes misses. And one of the things, well, there were two things in the process of writing the book that propelled me in part in this direction. One of it was in the writing itself, where I'd repeatedly tell my editor that should I really write this? Because everybody knows this already. I've said it 10 times. And she would say, yeah, well, nobody remembers it, or no, well, no one heard it. And there was that moment of humility of realizing that journalism can be ephemeral. And what's important, perhaps, is to build long lasting knowledge resources and for these to be public goods. So I spent some time after that trying to figure out what that could look like. That was one part of it. The other part of it was in the reception to the book. So the book did well, and I'm very happy about that. But one of the things that it also allowed me to do was to have much more and wider conversation with readers than I'd ever had before. So I did a lot of public events, and people would ask questions. This would go on after the event. We'd have chats, and one of the things I was really struck by is just how widespread this crisis of credibility and information is. So I was very struck by how much people would come up to me and say uh, that they didn't know where to turn for information. They didn't know how to trust information. And one of the things that really bothered me is that young people in particular, I found it very hard to trust data or information at all. They didn't know where it was coming from. They didn't know why they should believe it. And it was leading to this sort of air of suspicion about everything. And as a journalist, one of the things we are sort of born with an air of skepticism. We bear our skepticism very proudly. But for skepticism to jump shark and become blanket suspicion, a sort of knee jerk suspicion almost, struck me as damaging to democracy when you can't trust the foundations of anything that you're standing on. And I didn't think it was justified. I don't think that we are in a place where the data that we produce as a country warrants this kind of blanket suspicion. So those two things came together, where the idea then was to build a public good, a public resource, a knowledge resource, not ephemeral data journalism that vanishes overnight, and also to talk a lot about where the data comes from and give people that window into methodology, which I think helps build trust and credibility in not just the information that you're putting out, but in the entire ecosystem of data that it comes from as well. So that's what led to us building Data for India, where the idea is that we use public data, typically data produced by the Union Government of India or by multilateral agencies, to give insight into socioeconomic issues in India. And there's the information, the text, the charts, and the data for download itself available behind those charts.
I think it's incredible that something like this exists in the country. And what you talked about, journalists inherently knowing certain things that the rest of us don't. I'm reminded of Democracy on the Road, written by Ruchir Sharma, where he talks about the limousine liberals driving around the streets of Bihar, talking to people on the ground, and coming up with analysis that shocked the rest of the people sitting in an air conditioned room in Bombay. In your work at Data for India, with the book you wrote as a journalist. What is one bit of data that you know inherently that always shocks people that are sitting in those AC rooms or not on the ground, as it were?
So this one is sort of universal and it has really endured, which is I find that people are truly taken aback by just how low the share of intercaste marriage in India is. This is something that we've seen in the data a long time. It's an enduring trend. It's in the single digits essentially. And what we see is that it's changed very little over time. So the share of people in their 20s in India in an intercaste marriage is virtually no different from those who are in their 90s. It hasn't changed much over time. I think it's one of those things where many of us might feel that we are or we know people in intercaste relationships and marriages. So it seems like one of the things that the data gets wrong, or it's particularly hard to trust. So in some ways, I think it's a useful reminder that our bubbles are not necessarily representative of broader Indian realities. And this is really it's not a sort of normative finding, but it certainly is something that's worthwhile to repeatedly remind ourselves about.
The intercaste marriage discrepancy between what we believe or what we think it is and the ground reality strikes me as very interesting. It could also be because, as you correctly mentioned, we're living in our bubbles. I'm curious, do you have another example or a shred of data that shows us as it relates to Indian income or economics for people that are in this space?
I think what typically happens is that most data around consumption expenditure in India comes as a surprise to most people. So broadly about consumption expenditure, because we are a country in which incomes are hard to calculate. We know that roughly 3% of people are captured, pay income tax that can be captured. The share of salaried employment in India remains low. People get paid at different intervals of time. Agricultural income comes in multiple different ways. It may sometimes be paid in kind. It's not regular. All of that means that most people don't have a one number answer to what their annual income is, which makes it a surveyor's nightmare.
I can
So,
imagine.
what most developing countries, including India, do is they instead survey consumption expenditure, which is much more easy to assess correctly. And when I say easy, even that means that it is a questionnaire that involves, 300 plus separate pieces of information. Uh, Everything from salt to cars is covered in India's household consumption expenditure service, to the point that the most recent two that we've done were done over 3 visits, because of the insight that had come was that people were just exhausted by the end of the surveys. So to avoid tiring out respondents, it's now done in 3 separate visits. So it's hard to do, but we do it. We have a history of doing it for 50, 60 years now. Uh, and we use consumption expenditure as something of a proxy for income. Of course, the two are not the same. What it means is that you miss out on investment. That's the part that's can't be captured, but it still gives you a sense of change over time. And there too, the story is of increase over time. We're absolutely seeing that consumption expenditure is going up. It's going up not just the median or not just for the richest. It's going up for everyone. There is a broad story of a rising tide, raising all boats. But I think people still find the numbers a bit hard to wrap their head around. And I think that's because maybe most of us have reconciled ourselves to the fact that we probably live in the top fifth of the country. But I think just how large that top fifth is, and the fact that we don't, we can't claim the whole fifth of it. We live in a very sort of narrow, a very small gated community within that fifth as well, is something that people find it hard to wrap themselves around. So if you spend more than 10,000 rupees a month, that puts you in the top 20% of India. And I think that's typically something that people find very hard to wrap their heads around.
I think this is so important that it bears repetition. Now, in our country, the bulk of our country at the very least, and this is what I've understood from your answer, is that for us to get a proxy of income, we're actually saying, okay, we can't really calculate how much actual income you're getting because of the different sources and the fact that most of us aren't necessarily salaried. we're seeing medium consumption expenditure. So we're actually seeing, okay, how much is a person spending in a month to understand where is our country headed. We're seeing a rising tide lifting these boats, but let's stick to that number because I found that fascinating. You said if I'm spending 10,000 rupees, I'm somewhere in the top 20%. Could you further subsegment that for us? What is typically a one percenter then? What is a upper middle class? I know these terms are interchangeable and loosely used, but
Yeah.
just for everybody to get a sense, what would those numbers look like, or what is the data telling us?
Yeah. So I think it's also useful here to look perhaps at, let's talk about urban India only for a bit. We could talk about the overall numbers too, but particularly for the people watching, for you and me, this is what matters most. So for urban India, if you spend 13,000 rupees a month, and when I say spend, I mean on everything, all told, from rent to fuel to school fees, all of that. If you spend as an individual 13,000 rupees a month, that puts you in the top 20% of the country, the top fifth. If you spend more than 20,000 rupees a month, that puts you in the top 5% of the country. And if you spend more than 33,000 rupees a month, that puts you in the top 1% of the country. So I think it's useful though to, pull out one step, which is to acknowledge that uh, the way we get to individual expenditure in India is by dividing household expenditure by household size. And this may seem technical, but the reason it matters is we're talking about individuals. So we're saying 33,000 rupees a month puts you in the top 1%, which sounds almost it sounds beyond anyone's imagination. It doesn't sound like a lot of money. 33,000 is what a lot of people would spend on rent, for example. And the idea that that puts you in the top 1% seems wild. But then if you think of it as a family of four, and it's sort of equally assigned to each of them, that's over 1.2 lakh, 1.5 lakh, spending that much a month puts you in the top 1%. Now that makes a little more sense, right? I mean, at least it seems to have some resemblance to what objective reality around us looks like. Yeah, and those numbers, of course, vary by region, they vary urban, rural, they vary by city, but that's the sort of ballpark India number.
Interesting. So if we take the urban number and individual expenditure at 33,000, let's stick to 1% because that's the metric that most often interests people. So
Yeah.
if you're an individual in urban India spending 33,000 bucks, you're in the top 1%. And just out of curiosity, what would that number be if we did aggregated India as a whole?
Sorry, I don't
I was
understand.
saying it's only urban at
Yeah.
33,000.
Oh,
What would it
right.
be for an overall figure?
Yeah, so the equivalent top 1% in rural India spends substantially less, which is 17,000 rupees puts you in the top 1% of rural India. So aggregated, because rural India is still numerically much larger than urban, I would say it puts you, if we would be roughly in the say 25,000 category, 25,000 would roughly put you in the top 1% of India.
Interesting. So Rukmini,
So
then
that would be about a lakh a month. I like to repeat the household number because I think sometimes it can be slightly misleading to look at individual numbers, but 1 lakh again is a much more imaginable number, right? If you're spending 1 lakh a month, that means that the household is making more than that, say 1.5 lakhs a month. That has some relation, at least, to our notions of what reality could look like.
it certainly does. And yet, when we repeat these numbers, we tend to get a lot of surprise. There's the data, and then there's how you interpret and how you feel when you hear the data.
Right.
Have you noticed that people are taken aback when they hear these numbers, or why do you think that is? Why do you think people feel surprised when they hear these figures? And typically, the reaction is, okay, that's lower than what I thought it would be.
Yeah, I think that happens one step further when you start from the middle class number, which is something we, briefly touched upon. So I know that, the middle class is not a numerical middle, right? When we're talking about the middle class, we're talking more about a notion than an actual numerical middle. But I do think it's instructional to think about what the numerical middle also does look like, because it helps in some ways distinguish that from what our concept of a middle class could be. So if you look at the numerical middle of the country, the middle 20%, spending 5,000 rupees at an individual level, so 20,000 rupees at a household level, is what puts you in the middle 20% of the country. I think that's the one that gets particular surprise and pushback because it does two things at the same time. It is a very low number, and it also challenges notions of people's self-description as being middle class. And, I have a couple of things to say here. One is, I think it's important to talk about where this data comes from because there is no reason to believe me on something that sounds so fantastical unless I explain where the numbers come from. And in fact, if people listening felt that this was unbelievable or wrong, I would understand why they felt that way. The numbers seem fantastical, and I'm not telling you where the numbers come from. So of course, to look at it at length and in depth, I would encourage people to look up our explainer on how household consumption expenditure is calculated. That's there on Data for India. But essentially, this is a large household survey that's conducted by the government of India. It's a system that's been in place for over 60 years, but with constant updating. There's international supervision around this system, so it isn't something we've come up with on our own, and it's a large sample size of over 1 million households across the country. It's representative on various indicators. So this is where these numbers are coming from. They're produced by the government. Another point to make is that people often feel that, hey, I've never been surveyed. So are they really capturing people like me? Perhaps they're only going out and capturing the poor. The point of the survey is to try and be representative. So even if they haven't captured you and me in a survey, the hope is that they are capturing people at our income levels. We can look at the sample size to sort of convince us, not the sample size, sampling strategy to convince ourselves on that count. But there are refinements in the process. They've tried to do a better job of capturing the rich. I still think experts still think that they could do a better job. It's likely that they are missing some of the people at the highest end of consumption. So I don't think the number is hugely off. But if we feel that perhaps they're not adequately capturing income at the highest end or spending at the highest end, sure, there is some reason to have that concern. I wouldn't brush that off. That's one point. The second point is that, and I think the media in particular does this a lot, is that we give people the impression that if they don't have the accurate sense of something in the country, so for example, being vegetarian or intercaste marriage, or even on incomes or expenditure, we give people the sense that if you don't know this, it means that you spend all your time, in a bubble, and you're consuming only whatever Bollywood, and so you don't care about Indian realities, and this is why you, as an individual, are so disconnected from Indian realities. And I think that's placing the locus of responsibility on the wrong person. The locus of responsibility of making sure that people get this information should be on the producers of data and the communicators of data. And if people do not have an accurate sense of Indian reality, it means these two groups have failed. So I do, Data for India is very small, and we've just been online for a year now. But I do hope that over time, uh, we will, if we produce good resources, then we can shift the locus of responsibility back onto consumers. So maybe over 10 years, if we build Data for India out as something widespread and deep and widely available, maybe in more Indian languages, so it's widely available, then we can say, hey, you should have been able to look up this information. It's easy to find, it's reliable, it's trustworthy, it's credible. You shouldn't still not know where things are. And, I don't want to make this about Data for India alone. I mean, this entire ecosystem. But where we are right now, which is the data is still hard to access and make sense of, and the people who do communicate it often do it in very biased or polarized ways, then we can't place the locus of responsibility on consumers of information when getting that information is so hard. So if anyone listening didn't know any of the things we've talked about or are going to talk about, I see it as a failing of data producers and communicators and not of the people watching. It shouldn't be that hard to get accurate information as it currently is in India.
Well, I hope that after listening to this, we have a few more data communicators spreading the good word. Rukmini, as a young founder, typically when I'm trying to get this information, for example, size my market to see whether or not this is large enough for me to go after or to justify creating a new product, The way I currently do it is I fire up Google, maybe I get a couple of McKinsey reports. This is one very well-known method, one source, right? Now, thankfully, we have data for India, but how else can I get this consumption data? What are the right sources for me to go after? What do you trust as a person that's been in the space?
So I think this is not what you typically expect from someone with a journalism background. But the data sources that I personally go to and that we institutionally at Data for India go to are Union Government of India sources, typically. And these are for a couple of reasons. One is the sheer size of the sample. And it isn't just a flex to say I interviewed so many million people. It's not that's not what it is alone. It is because you need to get to a certain size to get to a level of complexity. So you can talk about say like online English speaking people only by doing something like a small online survey. But if you really want to be representative at the geographic level, at the caste level, among women, religious groups, etc., you need to go pretty big. And in India, you still need to do it on the ground. These need to be face to face. That level of this is very expensive, as anyone trying to do even a small survey will say. So this scale that comes from government surveys is unmatched. It's not just that uh, there is a statistical system in place that governs how we produce this data that comes from a rich and an intellectually sort of intellectual powerhouse background. This is a statistical system that was set up at the time of independence. It came with the imperative that statistics was going to be what delivered growth and development. So it needed to be a really good statistical system. We learned from the best in the world. We had the best talent in the world as well over here. I often think of it as analogous to the ISRO story in a way, which is truly a world-beating organization coming out of a country that was extremely poor at the time, and others may not have thought that this should be a top priority, but these were audacious dreams. So I find it a pretty romantic story. And if I was pitching to Netflix, I would be pitching the National Sample Survey as the next like OTT success. It could star Jim Sarb, who seems to star in all of these as Mahalanobis. Um, that's my pitch to Netflix. Um,
Well, we know
but
some people there. We'll hook you up.
Okay, awesome. No, don't hook me up, hook Jim Sarb up. I can stay this one out. um, uh, yeah, but so this is a system that had great pedigree that has continued to have massive international supervision over time. We conform to international standards. This isn't a case of bureaucrats fiddling with numbers in the dark somewhere. This is something that the world keeps an eye on. There is huge international and Indian debate about the smallest changes in methodology. So, sunlight absolutely exists on our statistical system. So there's scale, there's quality, and there's also innovation. And I think there is plenty to criticize the Indian statistical system on in terms of failings, in terms of innovation. So Pramit Bhattacharya, who is a data journalist, who was Mint's data editor and is now head of research at Data for India, has chronicled this, in great depth. And one of the things he talks about is after leading in terms in technological terms, that's something that we really failed on for decades. I think there is some amount of catch up and improvement that's happening now, but sure, there are plenty of failings. However, there is constant innovation. So things like, as I mentioned to you, this change in the methodology where they realized people were just completely exhausted by the end and it affected the quality of findings. That's just one example, but there is constant innovation about what questions to ask. So, for example, in recent surveys, we're seeing for the first time questions around the use of internet or apps to make purchases. I think that's a great post 2021 question to start asking in government surveys. We're seeing questions about phone usage. We're seeing questions about ICT skills, including questions about can you write a line of code. Now, in some ways, this really has been my big pitch and would be my big pitch to the listeners of this podcast in particular as well, is that there is sometimes a notion that government data is A, outdated, B, ask questions that are not of interest to the sort of people listening here and see unreliable. And I would push back on all these counts. I'd say that I think there is a lot of interest uh, on grounds like this, things like phone usage or programming abilities that people might want to know at an extremely granular level in one district in Kerala versus another district somewhere else, for example, in a particular age group, that you can know with a fair degree of confidence from government data. So that's the story of why we focus so much. I'm trying very hard not to use the word over-index. I'm just going to say focus so hard on government data. It's also because there is a paper trail of credibility and reliability. So we are not okay with using private data that others cannot check, and we have to do the trust me, bro, equivalent, which is to say, believe us on what we're saying on this data. We want people to be able to recheck our work and argue with us if they feel that something has not been looked at correctly or should be looked at in another way. We also want to be a citable resource that's citable in academic work, in people's presentations, in the work they're doing. We're happy to see us being cited on pitch decks, for example. All of this makes it important to use government data as well. Where there are issues with government data, we call it out ourselves. We do our own research on it and we write about it, and we've also been pretty happy with the response to it. We find that when you come from a place of good faith, as we feel we do, this is seen in a fairly constructive way. And we have seen positive responses to our criticism of specific aspects of government surveys as well. So we feel pretty good about that. However, the problem here is that all of this data speaks its own language, and that language is not the language that most other people speak, and it's hard still to make sense of. It's got a lot better, access to the data is better, it's all in machine readable formats now, which it was not earlier, but it's not the same as going on Statista, for example, and looking up something without even knowing very clearly where that data has come from. It takes a lot of work, and it takes a fair amount of interpretation. So again, I feel like I don't want to blithely tell people that why are you relying on these other sources? You should just look up government data. It's so much easier to. It is hard. It is very hard to look it up right now, and there are gaps. There are issues of periodicity. We know, for example, we haven't had a census in more than 10 years, and those are the sorts of things we should call out. Being happy with progress in government data doesn't mean that we can't call out issues where there are some. Um, so those are the sources I turn to, but I can't, in good faith, tell everyone I know to just as easily turn to them. I do feel that the quality of data journalism within the Indian media has improved vastly in the last 10 years. So I think there are still issues of sourcing and occasionally of partisanship. But broadly, all of the large English newspapers have good data journalists on their teams now. And every day you can see something of really good quality coming out to do with something in the news that I feel has shown real growth over what's happened in the last 10 years. So that's a little bit about the data sources we use as well as I recommend to others.
I love the nuance that you add when you're explaining things so that we know where to take a pinch of salt. What I took, two levers. The first is it fills me with enthusiasm that we can look at another institution in India with pride, just like how we look at ISRO. I did not have that level of appreciation for our statistical engine until I spoke with you today, and I hope that this permeates and a lot of other people start looking up to and respecting our organizations. Of course, we should hold them to the highest standard possible, but just to know that we've got a fantastic organization churning out wonderful information for us is great. The second, it fills me with curiosity because I did not know, for example, that we are asking information around digital usage, such as when was the last time you used an app? And if we were able to subsegment this by district or by state, that would certainly allow a founder to target better, if not just create. It would certainly allow me as an individual about to launch my next product the ability to find on-ground information that allows me to choose where to go next. So for me, this is opening up a new world. So Rukmini, I quite appreciate that. Pulling on that thread, let's talk about other things to be excited about, other things that fill us with enthusiasm. For the first time in a long time, rural consumption expenditure has dipped below half on food and food items. I think in urban, it's even below 40%. So how do we interpret something like that? And where do you think the rest of the spend is going, Rukmini?
Yeah, so that's one of those things that it's one of those line charts that really tells you a story in one line chart, which is, and it's again so relatable. You can think back to a generation before you or to your grandparents' generation, and we all know how much putting food on the table, how much a part uh, of the entire preoccupation of a household it was. And we also know that we've been able to move away from that. So does that mean that everybody's rich and money, food is not a concern for everyone? Of course not. But we certainly see that from a time when spending on food and cereals in particular, and I think to me that it's the food part, but it's also the cereals part, the fact that just the rice and wheat element of the diet even was such a big part of expenditure is it's quite moving to think in a way of being able to to be released from that utter dependence in a way. So yes, what we see is that from a time when food was the largest part of spending household spending, it's now less than half in both rural and urban India. It's been dipping for some time, and it's fallen. And cereals were always the largest part of spending on food, and we are seeing the share of spend on cereals fall as well. Now, this doesn't mean that people are eating less. What it means is that they're having to spend less of their entire basket on food and on cereals in particular. So with cereals, I think one of the big reasons for that is this big expansion in the Food Security Act that's happened again over the last 20 years or so, where there is substantial amounts of subsidized grain that is given to a very large net of households across the country. And that has allowed people to not have to spend on grains to that extent. When what we see when people's consumption baskets are freed up a little bit is that they start to spend more on other things, including health and education. So these are the non-food aspects of spending, of household spending. But one of the things we do sort of need to keep an eye on is that within food, what are the other parts that spending is going up on? And we're seeing, particularly in urban India, a huge rise in spending on processed food.
Yes.
Now, there again, I feel like it's useful to not instantly be normative about it. There's good research across the world to show what some of the reasons are behind spending more on processed food. People are time starved, being able to cook a meal and pack it early in the morning is a huge challenge. So sometimes, even when I'm dropping my kids off to school in the morning, I can see someone buying a packet of something to give their kids to go to school, and I feel huge empathy. The privileges that allow me to send a cooked meal for my children are not universally shared by everyone. So there is that aspect as well. There's also the aspect of being able to there's a hygienic aspect as well. So this is not me arguing that processed food is more hygienic, but all of these are decisions that households make, and so I don't want to instantly view it from a normative lens. However, from a public health lens, greater spending on processed food, especially beverages and especially aerated drinks, is of course a matter of concern.
Yeah.
So does this mean that we aren't that we aren't doing enough communication around processed food? Does it mean that there aren't enough cheap options that are not processed, but that are still serve the other advantages that processed food does? All those are uh, you know uh, big areas to consider for public health, because we are simultaneously seeing a rise in health surveys, a rise in obesity. It's very much the case in India. I think up to 10 years ago, it almost seemed like an indicator we didn't have to look out for in India, because there was much more the other challenge, which was of undernutrition. It remains a challenge. Undernutrition is not something that we've wiped out, but we are seeing a big rise in obesity as well.
As always, there's no one overarching story, and I think that is something that I keep taking away when you give us information. But what I would like to distill from that, because I'm a career optimist, is that if our overall average expenditure on food as a share of wallet is reducing, it means for the first time in many years, a lot of us now have the opportunity to spend money on things that we did not have the ability to. Uh, amusement, entertainment, personal growth. So that does strike me as something that is a little uplifting, at the very least.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially, I find these things are always useful to think of in terms of earlier generations, right? Who just did not have these options. So when you think of it as just having a little more elbow room to do a little bit more with the money that you've earned, definitely cause for optimism.
And sticking to food, because you did mention it earlier, but I think it bears repeating, and I'd like to go a little bit deeper here. You mentioned the split between vegetarianism and non-vegetarianism in the country, and that's always surprising when I hear it. But how do you get this data? How do you understand this? And could you talk a little bit more, or riff a little bit more on the split between vegetarian and non-vegetarianism in our country?
Yeah, sure. So I like that the data comes in a very direct way, which is by asking people whether they eat meat. I also like that there's nuance in how the question is asked, which is it, I think sometimes people feel that uh, uh, data that shows meat eating is about someone who's ever eaten meat in their entire life, and these are not regular meat eaters. But the data also asks whether you eat meat daily, weekly, occasionally, or never. The question is asked in India's National Family Health Surveys, Family and Health Surveys, which are conducted every 5 years. It's again a massive sample size, and it's conducted across the country. So one of the things we see there is that again, this is a constant indicator. We see that 8 in 10 adults say that they eat meat, and most meat consumption in India is regular. These are not occasional consumers of meat. We also see that if anything, there's been a slight increase over time. The increase is quite small, but over the last 15 years, in the 3 consecutive surveys, there has been a slight increase in meat eating. So it's not going down. We see a slight gender gap, at least in reported responses to the survey. We see men reporting higher levels of meat eating than women. But even among women, a large majority eat meat. It's still more than 3 out of 4. So it's not that changes it substantially. What we do see is definite geographic patterns. So there are just 4 or 5 states in the country that are majority vegetarian, and vegetarians really are concentrated in these states. And by the way, it includes Punjab, which I think is something that always surprises people because I think the cultural conversation around Punjab is much more meat eating.
Yeah.
And so that's one that I find regularly surprises people. Punjab is one of the only vegetarian majority states in India, includes Rajasthan, Gujarat. And the other thing that you see is that in the southern states, in particular, as well as the northeastern states, it's not just that these are meat eating. It's quite useful to see just how fringe vegetarianism is in these states. So, in all of the coastal states as well as the northeastern states, it's 3% of people who are vegetarian. So,
3%.
yeah, so
Wow.
Tamil Nadu, for example, is 3% vegetarian. And this always amuses me because I live in Chennai now, and it strikes me that outside Tamil Nadu, so much of the Tamil food that's known is vegetarian. It's
Yes.
the sort of dosa, idli food. So the area that I live in particular, but across Tamil Nadu, uh, so biryani is Tamil Nadu's true religion. I mean, I cannot tell you this state's enthusiasm. I'm not a native Tamil person, so some of these things are new to me as well. But it's not just that the shops are ubiquitous. The passion for biryani as well is not like something I've seen anywhere else. So when friends from out of town in particular visit me, they always ask like, "Is there something up with your street? Why are there so many biryani shops?" And I'm just like, "No,
All
this
over
is
the
just this is Chennai for you." So seeking out the best biryani, inter-district arguments about whose biryani is best. This is all very central to Tamil identity, and it always strikes me that the food conversation about Tamil Nadu outside Tamil Nadu is about dosas, while the true love is biryani.
Well, I think the data shows that Hyderabad biryani is best. So we'll we'll move on from.
I'm so shocked that I don't know where to start. I'm just going to say one word, and that's Dindigal. If there's anyone listening here who's not eaten Dindigal biryani, do it,
Yeah.
and then we'll
Wonderful.
talk.
I think I know what to order next when I'm in town. Rukmini, what I'd like to While we're in the discretionary spend conversation, one thing DFI put out that actually sparked interest in me was, while we're talking about large macro figures, you put out a piece that goes down to people are buying ACs and TVs. And what was interesting was people are spending more on televisions. More households have televisions and convenience items like a washing machine, or an air conditioner, given the heat waves that we're going after. So, what does that tell you about discretionary spend, or how should we interpret something like this?
Yeah, so we do see that the most widely owned electronic item in India is TVs, widely owned in most parts of the country, and steadily grown over time. Again, we see research from across the world, particularly from developing countries, that shows that this is the pattern. When countries or households get richer, the first thing to buy is typically a TV. I think there are plenty of non-condescending ways to think about this, which includes that a TV requires very little else to work, right? You don't require functioning water, you don't require you know connections with the water system as you do with for washing machines, for example. I think the energy consumption also of a TV as compared to an AC is, really not comparable. Very little other infrastructure required. So sure, people want more entertainment in their lives when they're able to afford it, but it's also that not just in terms of the one-time cost of buying things, but the overall cost of owning it is significantly less for a television. I think we see very geographically concentrated use of and purchase of ACs and coolers. Again, I think living in Chennai has completely skewed my notion of what temperatures in the rest of the country can look like. And when I looked at the AC numbers, I felt such deep sympathy for the rest of the country, but the rest of the country is not boiling all year round as Chennai is. So we do see that that is very geographically determined. But I personally was very struck and surprised by the washing machine numbers. So, as much as you might try to be sort of agnostic or neutral about data, which is nothing should surprise you because you don't already hold prior beliefs on where things are. You do, or I do, accept that I hold some sort of priors around what I imagine levels of growth and development in the country look like. And sometimes numbers come along that surprise you. In terms of making it seem that the country is poorer than you thought it was. And sometimes they come along in the other direction, which is they sort of remind you that perhaps you had the notion of a country that was less able to buy something like a washing machine than you did. So I wrote about this as well. I have a newsletter called The Big Shift, which tracks long-term change in India, and my draft title for the post was Bayesian washing machines, because there is the Bayesian notion of priors, and my priors on washing machines certainly were not in line with the numbers that came out. Just to give you a sense of what that data looks like. So yeah, so it's not just that 40% of urban households now have a washing machine, which really is a large number. Let me admit, it's much larger than I thought it would be. It's also the breakup by economic class. And I think this is really important because you might often feel that that 40% is heavily concentrated among the richest. But even among the poorest 20% of urban Indians, the poorest fifth of urban Indians, more than half own a TV, and 10% own a washing machine. 75% of the top 20% own a washing machine. I will freely admit this is not how high I thought the numbers would be. So in the not the poorest 20%, but the next poorest 20%. That's still a pretty poor part of the country. 1/4 of urban households own a washing machine. If you had asked me what this number was and I had to place money on it, I would have lost a lot of money. I would not have put it at 1/4 of households at all.
But when you combine the two pieces of information, the actual expenditure of people in the strata that we discussed earlier, and the ownership, I wonder how we reconcile these two. Would the answer be that there's an explosion of personal debt in the country? to purchase these assets?
Yeah, no, so I wouldn't say that this necessarily makes us think about that. We do have separate concerns about personal debt. We particularly have concerns because it's captured very poorly in data. So we've been looking a lot to try and accurately capture both investment and debt, and we find that that's poorly captured, especially when it is owed to non-banking institutions. And what we've all seen and what we all have worried about in the last few years is this explosion of apps, for example, lending apps that are very poorly regulated, um, and as well as things like repayment options of sites, etc., from which you can buy these appliances. So all of that is pretty poorly captured right now. I wouldn't necessarily say that you can say that one is the cause of the other. It could be that that these are being bought on sort of installment plans. But yeah, it does go to show what spending priorities are, right? And again, there are so many downstream effects and positive possible externalities of this. So we know, for example, from research that washing machines significantly free up women's time. It means that the time that women have to spend on unpaid household chores is reduced by having appliances like washing machines. So it's a really striking number for me for sure.
It is. It certainly causes one to sit and think, and in a good way, I suppose. Sticking to the financial aspect of the conversation, I think digital financial assets, they're showing a similar kind of a skew. While it sounds like the vast majority of us are banked, 9 in 10 of us hold a bank account. 1 in 4 has a debit card, less than 5% have a credit card. Could you add some nuance to these figures, or could you just help us wrap our minds around it? Because we're seeing an explosion of fintech companies, but this data sort of flies in the face of that. So could you just help add some nuance there?
Yeah. So first of all, what the overall, big numbers here are, which is that there really has been this massive expansion in access to banking. And what we do a lot is to usually is to spend time on finding the right indicator. So one thing that you could always do is just to look at the number of bank accounts, right, and show this big increase. But it's very important to us to also find good government surveys that ask people about whether they have a bank account in their own names, and we find that that number too is over 9 out of 10 people, men, women, have a bank account now. We don't have good data on how much money is in those accounts. What we have are averages, and we're not very happy using that number because the average held in bank accounts across a country feels like it really, the average held in bank accounts across my street, I feel, is going to tell me very little and is not a number I'd be happy putting out. So we don't know how much is in those accounts. We also have only some sense of what is being done by those bank accounts. So one thing we know from slightly older surveys, because this is not captured well in current government surveys, we've got some of this from the World Bank's Findex database, but that is a couple of years old. And I think what's really one issue with financial data is that there was such a huge pandemic bump, is that I feel very uncomfortable using anything that's even more than a couple of years old because we really know what a huge expansion happened there. So we see, for example, that in 2021, there was still a large number of bank accounts over half, in which very little activity was happening and were, almost technically dormant. But I imagine that that has changed substantially since then. What we're also seeing is that ownership and usage of debit cards and credit cards remains pretty limited. So credit cards in number, debit cards are slightly larger in number, but we see a real stagnation in usage and transactions over time. Again, one of those things that you can picture. I think the last time any of us went to an ATM, for example, is really hard to remember. We do see how much that has stagnated, and we see this absolutely massive increase in the usage of UPI that we very much see in the data. Given that it is tied to a bank account, if that is an indicator that counts as usage of a bank account, we imagine that that indicator has risen substantially as well. So we imagine that there is a big pre and post pandemic that there are two eras really over here. And the post-pandemic era is not one that is currently very well captured in the data. That's one part of it. But there are some trends that we've seen over time that we feel that we should be keeping a close eye on. So we do see gender gaps in usage. We've always seen a gender gap in access to bank accounts, and we continue to see a gender gap in things like usage and ownership of credit cards, etc. We don't have good data on gender-wise usage of UPI, for example, but that's something to certainly keep an eye out for as well.
Rukmini, could you just add some numbers? How can we visualize this gender gap in the usage of these financial products?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there is this pre and post pandemic time, but if we look at indicators around, we see that, for example, this is 2021 data when 7% of men had a reported owning a credit card, while it was 2% for women. And with a debit card, it was 35% for men and 19% for women. So really substantial differences. At that time in 2021, there was still a gender gap, very large gender gap in the usage of mobile phones or the internet to send money, where it was just 5% for women and 16% for men. But as I said, we do know that that number has increased substantially, uh, the usage of the internet to send money, because we also simultaneously know what's happening with UPI. And just to give you an example of UPI, in the 5 years to 2025, so 2020 to 2025, the average daily number of UPI transactions went from 40 million per day to 550 million per day. And if you look at the chart on our site as well, it's virtually a standing line. It's as close as you get to a standing line, with everything else having flat line. UPI has just completely overtaken all of this. I think one more reason to have some concerns about uh, the usage of UPI for men and women. I wouldn't say that I think women aren't using, that this sort of big leap that has happened isn't affecting women as well, and hasn't increased financial inclusion for them as well. But we do also see a baseline difference in access to phones and the internet for men and women. We find this quite substantial. And given that, we know that women are using phones, but many of them are using shared phones. It's a really substantial number, in fact. So, given that, I think thinking about what's going on with women's financial access on their own, with their own account and their own device by themselves, is something that should be studied better.
I think not just study better, but for the folks listening in that are planning to build your next big fintech company, we always say start with a big problem. This sounds like one of the biggest problems there is to solve, right? So improve the financial inclusion, figure out a product that allows people to use it in a accessible manner. I think that is something that I'm taking away from what you said, Rukmini.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's even the mobile phone one is something that we see that the gap is narrowing, but there's still something to, it's still worth thinking about that as of 2023, for example, uh, 52. So more than half of women used shared phones, of adult women were using shared phones, and just one quarter, just 27% used their phone exclusively, and 21% were not using phones. These were adult women, of whom one fifth, as of 2023 in India, were not using phones. They tend to be older, but it's a big difference between men and women, because the corresponding number for men was just 9%. Just 9% of men reported not using phones. And among men, exclusive usage of the phone was higher than shared usage. So it's still a very large number. Even among men, it was 44% of men reported using shared phones. So if you're thinking about fintech, you need to start first from looking at the data around phones. And I think when people talk about data around phones, they look at data around SIM cards and about handsets. Look at that too. We present that too. But we've got great Government of India survey data about phone usage, and we really should be looking at that more.
I think that gives us an indication or a feeling that there's massive headroom. because we
I
keep
absolutely
looking,
agree.
yeah, because we keep looking at the overall figure and we say, wow, that's, almost penetration of population. But then when you add the nuance of shared usage to it, that tells us we have so much more headroom
Yeah,
to
and it's
grow. Yeah.
also worth thinking about what that headroom is. Is the headroom purely in terms of a market, or is it also in terms of a conversation? So, just to add again, I feel like nuance is my middle name. So, just to add
That's
another
going to be the title.
to add another line of nuance there, 9 and 10 women who reported not using a phone. So, 9 out of 10 people who are not using phones live in a household where someone else has a phone. So it's not that you don't have access to a device. It's either uh, that there are restrictions in using it, or that you are also not able or not comfortable to use it at all. Someone in the household does have a device, but you are still there's still a fifth of women reporting that they aren't using mobile phones. And a fifth is a very large number. 21% of women reporting that, even if we say all of them are older, suppose all of them are in the 60 plus age group, it's still really something to think about, and of course has all of these downstream things to think about in terms of financial inclusion, in terms of access to information, all of those.
When we tell people target big markets, it sounds like there's a massive one out there and there's so many things to be built. Rukmini, last couple of things that I'd love to learn from you or talk to you about. I think the statistic around India's labor participation rate has always struck me as fascinating. Could you talk a little bit about one, for those of us that don't know necessarily what a labor participation rate is and how it's calculated, just what is that? And then what is that number for India today, and what do you think are the factors affecting that number?
Yeah, happy to do that. I mean, you couldn't get me to stop talking about it if you tried. Um, okay, so the way labor statistics or the economy think about work and workers is fundamentally like this, which is, if you are an adult, you either are working, you're in the workforce, or you're either working or you're unemployed, and both those together put you in the workforce, which means that you are either working or you're looking for work. And then there's a third category of people who are legally of working age, but are not are neither working nor looking for work. I think the term people tend to use is choosing not to work. But I'm not very happy using that term because we don't know what those barriers are, right? So, for example, if it's a physical disability, I wouldn't call it
We
choosing
can't add
not
a
to work.
label to it. Yeah.
Kind of add a label to it, and what we refer to them is people out of the workforce. So this means that you're of legal working age, but you're neither working nor are you unemployed. You're not looking for work at all. In most developing countries, two numbers tend to be quite low. The share of people out of the workforce tends to be low because most people are looking for work, and the share of unemployed also tends to be low because everybody needs to do some work. So, in most developing countries, you will find that the labor force participation rate, which is the share of the working age population who are in the workforce, is very high. It's over 80% usually. The only people out of the labor force are those who are either studying at the very low sort of bottom end of the age distribution, or people who are aged out. They're too old or they're disabled and they're not able to participate in the workforce. So that's what you would expect. But there is an unusual thing that we have historically seen in India, and at certain moments it has been sharper than others, which is that the labor force participation rate in India is lower than in emerging countries, emerging other emerging markets, including Brazil and similar countries of that sort. To
So,
put some,
so sorry. So, just to set this up for everyone and summarize before you actually give us the numbers,
yeah,
uh, what we're saying is, of the people in our country, if there are 100 of them that are in the working age and have the ability to work, choosing not to work, that number is what we are calling outside the workforce. Or the people that are currently working are what we're calling labor participation rate. Would you say that is the correct summarization?
that's right. So outside the
Perfect.
labor force is of working age, but not in the
Perfect.
workforce,
And the
neither working
benchmark,
nor working.
perfect. And the benchmarks we're hearing are around 80% in the more developed countries. So could you tell us about what's happening here?
So I think the numbers in India are such that when you look at it for men, they match with what you see in the rest of the world, which is about 80% of men are in the labor force. They're either workers or they're unemployed, and the unemployed number is very small. So the labor force participation rate for men in India is 80%, which is very close to what you see across the developing world and what you would sort of expect to see. However, the labor force participation rate for women has been for a long time much lower than you would expect to see in other countries. So it is currently 40, what is it? 41%, which is substantially lower than the labor force participation rate for women, for men. And just to put it in perspective, the majority of working age women in India are not in the paid workforce. So the majority of women in India who are of working age, 58% of women who are of working age are not in the paid workforce. And it's important to say not in the paid workforce because they are working. They are not working in ways that are classified in economics as being a paid work. These are women who tell labor surveyors, this is not my opinion, they tell labor surveyors that what they're doing is that they're working in the home. They typically, it says attending to household duties, which usually means a combination of childcare, elder care, cooking, and cleaning, with especially in the rural areas, some amount of work to do with household productive activities, which includes things like tending to a patch of land or something, but that isn't classified as paid productive work. So this number was actually much lower. It was in the 20s. The share of women who were in the workforce was in the 20%-ish range in the early 2000s. And that's when it really sort of set alarm bells ringing globally. So I think the sense was, okay, we know that there are a large share of Indian women who are not in the paid workforce, but you don't expect it to fall further. And what we really saw in the early 2000s was a fall. It remained quite low. And so I think the conversation around female labor force participation in India really sort of picked up maybe 5 or 10 years ago, where it became an important discussion in economics, but also in policy circles. You know, what are the reasons behind it, and what do we need to do about it? And the reason this is, it's not a sort of settled fact why this is happening, is because there's a sort of mix of reasons why this could be happening. And economists have published quite convincingly across the spectrum explaining, with these explanations. So I would say there isn't consensus on one clear reason. It is a mix of things that include gender norms about the role of women in society, including the role of women in work that involves leaving the marital home. Uh, so that there are gender norms there. There is also the quality of work, quantity and quality of work that is available out there. So in a country where paid work and quality paid work is squeezed, we know that there is a jobs crunch. That what often ends up happening is that the priority then goes to the man of the family to get that job. So whether there are jobs out there that are quote unquote suited for women. And when I say suited, what I mean is whether it is the kind of work they want to do, that they have the skills for, and that families find acceptable. Sometimes it's a mix of all of this, is also unclear. So it seems like it's a combination of factors that pull women into the house, as well as factors that are not able to pull women out of the house in terms of the quality of jobs being available out there, safety environments, travel, transport, all of those factors. But what we've seen now in the last 5 years is a shift. So we've seen for the first time in a long time an increase in the share of women in the paid workforce. We've seen it not just for 1, 2, 3 years, we've seen it substantially, consistently for over 5 years, which is why we too were prepared to write about it. I think there are some aspects of what's driving this change that sort of need to be thought about. One thing that we're certainly seeing is that uh, uh, the increase in jobs is not in casual labor. So one concern would have been if this was a big increase in casual labor, which means that these are poorly paid and that there's very little security to these jobs. So what we're seeing instead is an increase in self-employment as well as in some amount of salaried employment. These are the jobs that we're seeing for women. But one of the concerns that we're seeing is that many of these are jobs that are called subsidiary, which is they're not for a bulk of the year, they're for a part of the year. So what this means in terms of driving incomes up, which is what you would expect sustained employment to do, is still unclear when it's subsidiary work and not work that's consistently available throughout the year. But I think broadly there is grounds for optimism. I think the numbers now do show that there has been some sort of turning of the corner that's happened. That's one. Two is that we're not necessarily seeing these in absolute subsistence level jobs. That's good too. Whether this means that there has been a shift in norms or in the quality of jobs or quantity of jobs available, that's not entirely clear. But I also feel that we have seen it become a substantial part of the public conversation, both policy as well as corporate practices. So we see regularly now MOUs being signed between state governments and companies, for example, which say that okay, you're going to set up and then you're going to keep 50% of the jobs in manufacturing facilities, for example, for women. We're seeing a lot of infrastructure being built around new factories, which includes things like dormitories for women, hostels for women, that sort of thing. And then we're seeing a discussion around paid childcare, which I think a lot of women, particularly women watching or listening to this, would feel has a direct bearing on their ability to be in the paid workforce. So we saw it as part of the budget discussion this time, and so what this means for signals to the public conversation, I think those are all very positive. What it means for women's work and for the economy, that's still something of a work in progress.
I think it fills me with energy and enthusiasm again that this is improving. I think if we are to realize our ambitions of GDP growth or whatever metric it is that we want to, we all aspire to a better life, a better country. And it
Yeah.
seems like increasing women labor participation is going to be a massive lever to get us there. We're not where we want to be, but at least we're pointing in the right direction, is what I'm getting from you. And that definitely, fills me, and I'm hoping everybody that's listening with energy and enthusiasm as well. I know that it might be different in different regions of the country. I know in the south, for example, lower birth rates mean less children to take care of at home. There's always going to be nuance to that. But Rukmini, just to take everything we've discussed over the last hour or so, and impossible almost to draw a conclusion, but I want to make sure that nobody thinks that the point of this conversation is, oh, India's a lot poorer than you thought it was. That's not what this is about. It's about nuance, right? So, what would you like a startup founder, a person that's about to embark on what is probably the most optimistic thing they're ever going to do, which is starting a company in India? What would you want them to take away from this conversation, or in general, your practice of building data for India, writing whole numbers and half truths? What would you like to talk about?
So I think I'd really come back to what drives my optimism, which is what's happening with Indian data. And I'd like to encourage much more people to pay better attention to what's coming out from public data, not just small private sources, but the sort of data that we've talked about, which does what you were describing earlier, which is it helps people situate the work that they're doing within broader or wider Indian realities. And I think putting uh, putting words down to what an Indian reality is never going to be easy. And there's multiple ways to come at it. People do it from everything from film to looking at numbers. But I think my learning over the last 10 years has been that we often feel that it's only field experience that gives you a real sense of what Indian realities can look like. But I think my pitch has been that looking at good public data can give you a much better sense of what the country really looks like in ways that are surprising across the spectrum. As you said, it isn't that there is one story and that isn't a story of everything being much bleaker than you imagined. I mean, I think the washing machines example really is that to me, just the nuance in it. So I think access to public data has driven my optimism around what can be said about the country. I would encourage more people to use this more widely and not live within bubbles and echo chambers. We are doing all that we can to make this data more accessible because I don't think it should be hard work as it is right now. Um, and I think continuing to look at nuance is important. We've been very struck by how much of the received wisdom on all the topics that we write about is plain wrong. And I think these are sometimes narratives that just get handed down over time and take on the veneer of truth, while looking at the data itself produces a much more surprising and original view of the area that you're looking at than relying on these sort of tired narratives. So that's what I'd encourage people to do. Look much more at the data itself. We are here to help with that. But form your own new view because a lot of the old narratives really get the country wrong.
Rukmini, can't thank you enough for your time. Thank you for being such a refreshing voice in data journalism. I'm certainly a big fan, and I'm sure you have a bunch more after this. Really appreciate your time with us today.
Thanks, I had a great time talking to you.